Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Inshallah, we'll begin every single gathering every week just with the same intention that we did in the last week, right? Which was the famous intention of Imam Haddad, which is نويت التعلم والتعليم والتذكر والتذكير والنفع والانتفاع والإفادة والاستفادة والحث على التمسك بكتاب الله وسنة رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم والدعاء على الهدى والدلالة على الخير ابتغاء وجه الله ومرضاته وثوابه وقربه سبحانه وتعالى. I'll repeat it in English, inshallah, in every class, and you all can repeat after me. I intend to I intend to teach and to learn. And you guys can say it to yourself, you don't have to say it out loud. To teach and to learn. وَالتَّذَكَّرَ وَالتَّذْكِيرَ, to remind and to be reminded. وَالنَّفَعَ وَالْإِنْتِفَاعَ, to give benefit and to take benefit. وَالْإِفَادَ وَالْإِسْتِفَادَ وَالْحَثَّ عَلَى التَّمَسُّكِ بِكِتَابِ اللَّهِ, and to call people to the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the sunnah of His beloved sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, and hoping for nothing except His good pleasure, His rida, and to see His face azza wa jal on Yawm al-Qiyamah, and for acceptance and for sincerity, right? And so we begin with that intention, and any other intention that our teachers would have, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would have wanted us to have, that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam would have had as he entered a gathering had he been here, sallallahu alayhi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Inshallah, with that we'll begin. Who remembers what we discussed last week? I know you weren't here, but if somebody wants to give a very quick, just like, Cliff Notes, one, 2 bullet summary. It's okay if you can't either. I can do it.
Last week we just talked. Well, you did like an introduction and then like the character of the Prophet ﷺ. So you're like, you have 5 pillars of Islam, but each one even has its like own restraints or things of like, well, there is like, you can refrain from it. So like there is a reason why maybe you cannot pray or you cannot complete Hajj. But the one thing that is not like excused upon is good character.
Very good. And so we talked about, for those of you that weren't here, the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He's given certain obligations to us, and the reason for those obligations is to get nearer to Him, right? There's nothing that is a fard upon us, there's nothing that He's asked us to do except, 1, that is good for us, and 2, it gets us closer to Him. And so a lot of the scholars, what they say is that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes something fard for you, when it's an obligation upon you, in reality what He's doing, and the way we need to think about this, is that He's making His happiness and He's making Jannah an obligation for you. And when you think about it from that lens, it's a really beautiful thing, because it no longer becomes, oh, I need to do this, or why do I need to do this, right? But rather, you're recognizing that anything that He's asking us, number 1, you look at any of the obligations, they're all beautiful things. They might be hard on the nafs, right? They might be things that take your time, they might be things like that, but they're inherently beautiful things, right? For a person to lower themselves and humble themselves and submit themselves, there's nothing anybody can even accuse it of being something that has any misinterpretation of intention or ugliness in it, but rather it's even for somebody who wasn't religious, right? And this happens a lot, that they'll look at something like salah, or they'll look at something like fasting, and they'll say, what a beautiful act of devotion, right, that it is. And so, as our sister, what was your name again? I don't think I got it last time.
Oh, Raisa.
Raisa, okay, as our sister was telling us, that what we closed on the last class with was that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we know we have the 5 pillars, right? We know that we have things like the shahada, praying, fasting, Hajj, etc. But even those 5 pillars, they're actually not fard for everyone unanimously. And the reason for that being is that not everyone meets the criteria, right? There are some people who can't, they don't meet the threshold, the nisab, to pay zakat. So zakat is not fard for them. There's some people who can't afford to go to Hajj, so Hajj isn't fard for them. But what is an obligation upon everyone, and this is exactly what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala praised Him for, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, in the Quran, is good character, right? That He says in many different ayat, one of the ones we quoted last week was, وَإِنَّكَ لَعَلَى خُلُقٍ عَظِيمٍ, that of all of the attributes, and He could have praised the Prophet ﷺ, who is known by many nicknames, by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and by His companions, right? But out of all of His nicknames, He chose to praise Him by His akhlaq, by His character. And that there's other verses that come in this book, if you have read it, that summarize that. For example, those of you who know 29th juz or Surah Nun, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم نون والقلم وما يسطرون ما أنت بنعمة ربك بمجنون وإن لك لأجرا غير ممنون وإنك لعلى خلق عظيم. That this verse was revealed in relation to the fact that people were calling the Prophet ﷺ somebody who was crazy, right? Majnun. So they saw somebody who was calling to good things, but was challenging their status quo and saying this person is a crazy person. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who's coming to his defense, right? It wasn't his companion, just his companions or other people, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals a verse saying, no, you are not Majnun. That not only are you not crazy, but in fact you are the person of the most, noble of characters. And what a high praise that is, right? Imagine God Azza wa Jal himself coming to your defense. And not only that, but that he's praising you by the status and the exaltation of your character. And that's a beautiful thing. And we know that this is who he was, right? Before Islam, after Islam, nobody could accuse him of bad character. And so what did they do? They accused him of, being a sorcerer, being insane. But nobody could dare accuse him of something everyone knew was false. Right? Nobody could dare accuse his character. And this is why the way that we do da'wah to people, both the Muslims and the non-Muslims, and arguably in today's time, the most important thing for a person is to do da'wah to Muslims, because there is so much now, unfortunately, divisiveness or lack of knowledge. And so what you'll see, this was actually probably the biggest surprise to me when I went to go study with my teachers. They would say something along the lines of, this teacher, one of our teachers, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect him and increase him, Habib Qadim, that they would say he's out doing da'wah. And I'm like, the whole entire city is Muslim. Like, what do you mean? Right? Like, the entire country is Muslim. So, like, where is he doing da'wah? But they refer to da'wah as going and meeting people, right? Spending time with them, reminding them of the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, reminding them of his characteristics. And that's a beautiful way to think about it. Right? Da'wah is not just interfaith work. It's not just calling people who are not Muslim, who a lot of times, even though that's very important and crucial, they may not be as receptive if they don't know you, right? So the first da'wah that you do is your character, because that is how they get to know the deen and what you preach. And so what we'll focus on here, we'll just read a very brief tidbit of chapter 2. We won't go necessarily in order because some of the chapters are related to each other. And so we'll just start with, inshallah, chapter 2. I'll just read this part because it's very quick, and then I'll have someone read chapter 3. This is close to where we left off. And so the author says that we see many people spending money and undergoing great hardship in order to beautify their outward appearance, right? And this is what you see in whether it's social media, etc., that not only will you spend like all of the money that you've earned on things like, beauty products, and this happens so much more with men now, unfortunately, today, right? And not that there's anything inherently wrong with trying to beautify yourself, but rather being excessive in it. Right? And not only that, but they'll undergo great hardship, and how much mental stress and burden, and even physical stress and burden. I know of people that, if something is, for example, like sold out in a store that they really want, they will drive 50, 100 miles to get that because they need it that day, because they have an event the next day. And they're like, what are people going to think of me if I don't, have the typical routine that I go through? And so what he's saying is that you see people going through all of these lengths just to beautify their outward appearance, all of which amounts to nothing in comparison to the perfection of noble character and the inward. And that a mu'min, right, a believer, must recognize this fact. And so we take, and this is first and foremost for myself, that the next time we see ourselves worrying about, oh, there's a wedding tomorrow, oh, I'm going to this event, how are people going to perceive me, right? There's nothing wrong with trying to beautify yourself and trying to be, and it's a sunnah to be a person who is not only beautiful, but a person who is who makes a good impression on people. These are good things. But rather than we ask ourselves, do we hold ourselves to the same account and standard in terms of how is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala perceiving me? How is He perceiving my intentions? How is He perceiving how I interact with people? And one of the ulama, one of the scholars of the 6th century, meaning the Islamic calendar, said whoever gives nourishment to his body priority over the nourishment of his soul, then let him seek his reward from the fish and the worms that will devour his body. And take a moment to think about that, because what he's saying, right, and this is very deep, that you're seeking, you think that you're seeking reward from the people. You're seeking a good opinion from them. You're seeking them saying, oh, look how good he looks, or how good she looks, or all of these things that you're seeking, right? But in reality, what you're seeking is that same body that you're beautifying. You're spending all of your time, all of your energy, right? And think about this even in the context of the gym, right? Again, I'm not criticizing that, but rather, again, it's a sunnah. It's a sunnah to take care of your body, to take care of your health, to work out. These are beautiful things. But there are people who go to excesses in it. So much so that they spend all of their time, 99.9, and I'm speaking like from experience, not that clearly you can tell I'm not somebody who works out too much, right? But there was a period in my life, because it's something that is messaged to you, that, gaining and bulking and all these things are very important. They're very big things. But it got to a point where all of your expending energy, the energy that you're expending is, how many calories are in this, right? Can I put extra olive oil into the shake to be able to do it? Can I grind my oats to a finer, powder so that I can put more of it into my shake, right? And all of your headspace is in that space. And then when Ramadan comes, you lose it all. And that's why I was like, okay, I'm just going to do whatever I can on a daily basis and leave it at that. But the point being is they do this, and I have a friend who's like this too, who realized it's a waste of time to do this throughout the year. So what he does is he'll get his body to a certain shape. He'll lose it throughout winter because he's not going out, right? But there's a thing as muscle memory, so that it doesn't take you the same level of effort to build, right? The same amount of muscle if you've already had it. And so just 3 weeks before summer, he gets his summer body in shape, right? And this is a thing that people think through. It's a very real reality. Right? And what the Imam is saying is a person who is too concerned about this, who's over concerned about this, in reality, what you're doing is spending your whole life living to prepare your body for the worms that are going to eat it once you pass away. Right? So what's left? Right? What's left for there to be? And we think very highly of ourselves for achieving these things, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says in the Quran, in Surah Insan, for example, that هَلْ أَتَى عَلَى الْإِنسَانِ حِينٌ مِّنَ الدَّهْرِ لَمْ يَكُنْ شَيْئًا مَذْكُورًا. That hal it's a question. Anytime you see the word hal, right, or right, that's a question in the Quran. So hal ata ala al-insan, does mankind not remember a time, hinum min ad-dahr lam yakun shay'an madhkura, that they weren't even something that was worth mentioning. This is such a, like, this ayah alone, there are tafsir and like commentary on it that you could spend a lifetime, right, reading through. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that, how a person thinks they're the center of the world, that if this doesn't happen, what are people going to think? What am I going to do if things don't work out the way that I want? Or I think so highly of myself and everyone else is so below me. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying there are people that lived, tens of, billions, even trillions of people that lived before you. No one talks about them. There are billions of people that are going to come after you. No one can remember them. So do you not remember the time where you weren't even something that was in existence, right? Nobody cared about you, no one thought about you, no one mentioned you, but you think so highly of yourself, right? And so this as a reminder that the Imam is saying that if it's too excessive, really all you're doing is you're benefiting the worms that are going to come in the ground after you. And similarly, this concept applies to anything dunyawi related. And you see a lot of the scholars talk about, for example, wealth. The people will spend all of their time, all of their energy, all of their effort trying to gain as much as they can. And then what happens? They pass away. And who benefits from that? It's not them, but rather it's the people that fight after that for who's going to get the biggest share of this and who's going to get the share after that. And so the people who are really benefiting from all of your effort isn't even yourself. It's the people that come after you. And it's a core principle, right, in the dunya, that it's meant to deceive you in thinking that you're going to get something out of it. But in reality, the things that you get out of it are minimal, and it's the people that will come after you that are going to benefit from all your hard work. And there are studies, and I shared this in another talk before. I can't remember the exact statistics, but if you Google it, you'll see that this concept of generational wealth is a big thing. right? And it's a very real thing, and when you talk about it in the context of racism and privilege in terms of people who have established themselves, right, in this country and in others, and being able to carry that for their family, it's a very real thing. But what the statistics like factually show is that a person who leaves generational wealth for their family or for anyone it is, even if it's under legalities of trusts and all of these protections meant to preserve it, that by the next generation, 50% of that wealth is gone. And by the third generation, it was 80 or 90% of it is gone. Right? And so we have all these grand ideas of who's going to benefit, how are we going to do it, but in reality, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has His own plan. Right? You can do as many precautions as you want, but you're not there to govern it. You're not there to control it. And so this is just a gentle reminder to ourselves that think very deeply about any action that you take. That, am I really benefiting from this? And number two, am I preparing myself to benefit from this in the akhirah? Imam Haddad, and we'll end this chapter with reading this quote. And we talked about who Imam Haddad is, right? He's the one who we read his intentions. He's a descendant of the Prophet ﷺ. One of what we didn't say last time, right, is how many of you have heard the concept of a mujaddid, or a renewer? Do you want to tell people what that is?
It's basically a concept of like a reviver of the deen that supposedly comes every century.
And do you know where that comes from? You just alluded to it.
Where did these come from?
The concept of like every century, or the reviver.
Hadith?
It comes from a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala every 100 years will send somebody to revive or to renew Islam. Right? And nobody knows who that is. But in general, when you look retrospectively, and people in that time actually don't know, right? The people are veiled from it. Right? So you look at people like Imam Ghazali, or even, for example, many of the Sahaba, or Imam Haddad is one of these examples, that in their time, people think that they're just a common person. They don't recognize how special they are. They don't recognize how many, literally millions of people, hundreds of years after they pass away, are going to benefit from them. Right? And so the first people, and one of my teachers actually said this to me, the first people that are veiled from the friends or the companionship, the people who are like the friends of Allah, meaning the people Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protects, right, is actually first their family. That's a scary thing to think about, right? How many people could be special within our own family, but because we're so close to them, we kind of forget to check in with them. We forget who they are. We forget to attend to their needs. We forget to realize the weight sometimes of the things that they're doing. And the people after that are their closest circle, right? Their neighbors, their friends. And so this is a principle that you see in many other aspects of life, right? The people that you could say you're most hurt by are the people that you are closest to, right? Because they know you in the greatest depth, but in reality, they've glossed over the most core important part of you. And so Imam Haddad, and I speak about this because he's known as the Mujaddid of the 12th century after Hijrah, meaning it's pretty recent, right? I don't think I said this in the main group. I said it with the guys. But when you think about it in context of the 12th century Hijrah, relates to about the year 1700 in our modern calendar. And so does anybody know what was happening in the 1700s? Like AP US history or anything like that? Yeah.
American Revolution.
Yeah, right? And so it blows my mind when I think about this, because sometimes we think about this in the context of, oh, this was thousands of years ago. But in reality, Imam Haddad came just a few decades before George Washington. Right? And these are special people, right? So at the time, all these people are focused around like, oh, all of this, look at all these contributions, all of these things that people did. And our teachers say this too. If you want to praise someone or their methodology or what they spent their life doing, look at the fruits of it. Right? What are the byproducts of that? And so you can make the argument, again, this is not a sweeping generalization, but rather, you want to talk about people who spent their life devoted to, political matters, or even getting us freedom, which are great things, and we acknowledge the tremendous blessing and the privilege that we have from that. But look at the societies and environment that we've cultivated today. Right? For the vast majority of people in our society, are we happy people, or are we, in general, good people? Right? And this is a byproduct of the things we spend our time preoccupied with. But rather than when you look at people who spent their life serving Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, learning about the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and look at the byproducts of that, right? And how many people, and we'll get into some beautiful stories here, how many people benefit from those people for centuries, for literally centuries, and still continue to benefit from them. And so Imam Haddad, as we talked about, he was known as the renewer of the 12th century. Imam Ghazali is one of these people that I believe, and I can't remember, was known as the mujaddid of his time. He was known as the renewer of his time. Right? There are a lot of big names that you hear about. These are the people whose works stood the test of time, and people still benefit from them. And so he says that there are those graves whose inhabitants have become decayed bones, after having been corpulent and obese, after craving and devouring the good things in life, and worms proceed to devour them beneath dust and mud bricks. And the summary of this, as you all can read on your own, is right, there are people who, as they pass away, they're inhabiting the graves, and all they are bones. And this is after they had flesh on their bones. This was after they spent their lives eating and indulging in the world and taking everything. But in reality now, all they are just decaying bones. So none of that benefited them. All of it disappeared. The color has changed and effaced the beauties of their face, the eyes and the cheeks. Loathed are they by all those who formerly displayed fondness for them. This is such a deep meaning, right? He's saying the same people who claim to love you, the same people who spent their lifetime around you, the same people who you benefited and spent your lifetime with, that if they were to see you now, that they would be disgusted by you. Right? And many of the ulama, they say anytime you get prideful, right? Anytime you even think for a moment that you're better than someone else, remember that, and this is very, I don't want to say extreme because there's a lot of wisdom in it, but they always censored themselves and reminded themselves by reminding themselves of how lowly they were. And they would go to the extent saying that, right, remind yourself that you were created, your entire essence, right, is from a drop of a filthy or a dirty fluid. And that you spend your entire lifetime being nothing except a walking pile of, does anybody know this saying? Right? Of basically, what's the polite word for it? I can't remember what they use, but basically it's like you're a walking bag of excrement, right? Because a person cannot live except that every single day they need to relieve themselves, right? And you carry that with you. And that when you die, you become nothing except food for the worms. Okay? And this is just humility of the scholars, humility of the teachers. Obviously, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself in the Quran, he praises us, right? That he says, I believe it's لَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ فِي أَحْسَنِ تَقْوِيمٍ, that we created insan fi ahsani taqwim, in the most perfect of form. And so this is not defacing or insulting our creation. No, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he acknowledges our eliteness and our status, but on account of that, we have responsibilities for that. That we don't just consume everything. And if you actually think about this purely from a logical, like a rational perspective, because I think about this so much, think about how many, what we say 6 billion, I can't remember the number of people there are in the world, right? Or maybe that's just Muslims, I can't remember. But whatever the number of people there are in the world, then think about the number of people that came in a generation before us, and then a generation before us, and then all the way until the beginning of humanity. How many trillions of people is that? Then think about the number of resources they consume on a daily basis. Like I think about this all the time. My wife makes fun of me for it, because I sometimes am very like, you know, if I don't need to use AC, I'm not going to use AC, right? If I don't need to like eat this extra meal, I'm not going to eat this meal. The reason being is how many people just like consume and consume and consume and consume on a daily basis, and how many resources does that take in a day from a single person? Now extrapolate that to billions of people on a daily basis, then extrapolate that to a year, then extrapolate that to a whole existence of humanity. That number one alone is a proof enough of the existence of Allah. How many resources are there in such a limited and a finite world to sustain that level of population? It blows your mind. And I used to think a lot about, in the context of like the meat that we eat, right? Whether it's chicken or fish. I'm like, if a person is eating meat every single day, you're talking about one chicken is being slaughtered per the population. This is like actually mind-blowing. Are you telling me that there are 6 billion chickens slaughtered a day? Like, where are they coming from? Like, where do they exist? And this is from the fadl of Allah, right? From the ni'mah of Allah, that we don't know the actual intricacies. You can do all these mathematical equations. It doesn't account for the unseen. right? And they exist, right? And it's tangible reality too. But there's obviously something happening in the background to sustain that. Right? Anybody who denies that or says it's purely coincidence, right, you can use your own rationale or logic to recognize how silly of an argument that is. Right? And the first time that I used to be very scared of water, right? And a big question that I had, not a big fish that I had, a big question that I had was, you have the ocean, which is actually bigger than the world, right? 70%, right, of the world. But again, similarly, you look at these documentaries of how many fish are fished on a daily basis on one boat, like that they literally look like they take out the entire ocean in one boat. Like, it's mind-blowing. And the first time that I went like scuba diving, how many people have been scuba diving? Anybody? If anybody, whether you're scared of water or not, like, highly encourage, especially post-college, or take a sabbatical from work, take a week to get your scuba license. And I promise you that will actually make you stronger in your iman. And one of the biggest things that it did for me, I'm not even joking, that I was terrified of water, and I promised myself that I'm going to get over this fear, right? And the way that I did that was I decided to jump into the ocean. Not something that's usually a smart thing to do. But subhanAllah, when I did that, and you look literally like 50 feet from the coast, right? And then you get into getting into the middle of the ocean, etc. And you look at the hundreds of schools of fish that are right below the surface. We're not even talking about the depths of the ocean. We're talking about like right there. And this is like even snorkeling, right? The fact that you can peek your head in the water, and they say that the oceans are like hundreds, even thousands of miles, I believe, in depth. And the fact that there is life on even just the surface of that is a miracle, right? That you can even witness that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could have created the ocean such that all of the life was on the bottom and you wouldn't even have known that anything existed. Okay? And that when you look at it and then you realize all of these different forms of life, and the way that my favorite thing, I don't have time to do this anymore, but I used to love watching like Planet Blue and all of these ocean documentaries, because it's not even about the life that's in there. You look at how many people have like learned in biology, etc., about like symbiotic relationships and all of these things, right? The fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created certain animals to benefit to work together, right? There are certain fish, for example, I think it's like a grouper, or there are certain fish that basically don't have the ability to hunt on their own to eat. And so what they do is they work with octopus, or octopi, right? To actually catch food for themselves and for the octopus. So if one of them didn't exist, the other would go extinct. This is such an insane thing to think about, like how intricately balanced and delicate the world is. And not only that, but then you've got thousands of forms of life that are so different and unique in their capabilities. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sustained all of that. And sorry, that was a very long-winded tangent. I can't even remember what we started with. But yes, highly recommend, if you take away anything from this class, get your scuba license. And you can tell your parents I said that. But basically,
Where did you do it as scuba?
mine was in Thailand. So yeah, you can do it even in Chicago. There's lots of places, but there's a difference when you do it in an actual ocean, right? Because you get to see the life. So inshallah, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us all able to be able to reflect and witness His signs like that, because there's nothing stronger or more beneficial for your iman except that there's this concept, right, in Islam. How many of you have heard about, and this is directly from the Quran and the Hadith, the concept of like ilm al-yaqeen, ayn al-yaqeen, and haqq al-yaqeen? Does anybody know those three? Or can anybody explain it to people? Right? Ilm al-yaqeen is you have knowledge of faith. Right? It's knowledge of faith. Basically what we're doing in this class. You're learning something, you learn something from the book, you read it, you have knowledge of it. And for those of you who know, for example, one of my other teachers, not direct teachers, but somebody I've benefited from a lot, how many of you know Sheikh Mikhail Smith from Qalam? Right? And he's an awesome person. I highly recommend his book. It's about the emotional intelligence of the Prophet ﷺ. But he gave this example that stuck with me, which was, a person who is in, say, what's a random country? Just say like, I don't know, Costa Rica or Panama, for example. And they read in a textbook or somebody tells them about snow, that's ilm al-yaqeen. Right? They know snow exists. They've never had snow in Costa Rica, or at least I don't think that they do. But they know it exists. But now a person in Chicago, right, the first time they experience winter and they see snow hit the ground and they feel that in their boots, right? That's Ayn al-Yaqeen. That's you're experiencing it, right? You witnessed it. And so that's the difference, right? Especially when you think about that in a knowledge sense, that you can know about. Actually, I'm going to go a lot very deep here, so follow me for a second. That for ilm al-yaqeen, you can know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exists, right? Ayn al-yaqeen is what we're just talking about, that there are certain times that if you are intentional in your life, that you will see signs of His existence because they're all around us. You will see them, and that you will see this undoubtedly an ayat of Allah, right? He says in the Quran, this is an ayah that I have shown to you as a proof of my existence. That's Ayn al-yaqeen, that you see something and then you recognize it. And this is what salah is supposed to be. Salah is not supposed to be something that you whip out your phone, you're like, it's time for dhuhr. What is salah centered around? How do we know it's time to pray? The different phases of the sun, right? And so the ulama say that what you're supposed to do, and it's a sunnah actually, because they didn't have clocks at that time, is when it's time for a prayer, go outside and look at where the sun is, right? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala uses that as a specific marker, right? There's a reason the sun is an indication of the times to pray, because it's a sign that reminds you of Him. Anybody who reflects on the sun and the moon and the perfect balance of stuff, they'd be crazy to think that there's nothing behind this, right? You all are close by. I'm sharing this because we just did this 2 weeks ago. But if you have the chance to go to an observatory, right, whether it's Adler or Northwestern, right down the street, actually has weekly on Fridays at 10:30 walk-ins for their observatory. They'll let you use their telescope, and you can look at the stars and the moon, etc. And I remember, like, my family and I went, and we didn't know what to expect, right? They're like, we're gonna look at a star, and we're like, whoa, we're gonna look at a star. And then you look in the telescope, and it's like this blur that's like all the way in a black background that you can't even tell is a blur. Like, that's how far away it is, right? So if you look at it from that lens, you're like, there's nothing. A lot of people are like, oh, okay, this is underwhelming, I'm gonna go. But then you ask them that, what are we looking at, right? How far away is it? And they're like 25,000 light years. And like the fact that you can look with your own eye, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even created, of course it's through a telescope, etc., but you can observe that. 25,000 light years means you can live for over 300 lifetimes. And that you're traveling in the entirety of those lifetimes at the speed of light, and you still wouldn't reach that star. And the fact that there's life that exists beyond that, right? These are all ayat, these are all signs of Allah. Right? And so again, like all of these little things, you get an opportunity to witness them and to observe them, they get you to ask questions, right? And then the last level, so we said, ilm al-yaqeen, ayn al-yaqeen, and then haqq al-yaqeen. And this is the deep part. That, what does haqq mean? Right? Truth or reality, right? Haqq al-yaqeen is that experiencing something in its reality, meaning you don't need proof of it, you don't need to see it, you don't need knowledge of it. And so actually when you look, and people like Imam Haddad are proof of this, and this happens throughout Islam in a lot. It actually happens in other religions too, because the way that we understand this is all knowledge from Allah. People outside the religion, if they're still dedicated to a certain spiritual path, they may still experience the similar things. It doesn't mean it's accepted from them. This is very important. Right? Because when you learn about miracles from, like, Buddhist monks, for example, etc., they're actually following Islamic principles, if you look at it, right, in the context of what practices that they're doing, for the most part. But haqq al-yaqeen means you get to experience reality. So there are actually scholars and ulama, there are people who didn't even spend, I've shared this with my family before, so I'm laughing, but there are people who didn't spend their entire lifetime studying Quran or studying fiqh or studying hadith, but there are people who literally wake up one morning and they've already memorized the Quran. And many of these teachers, like that we've studied from, they know their teachers or teachers and teachers are people who have experienced this. Well, what is that? You can't explain that rationally, right? And not just the Quran, but also lots of other, like, we're talking about knowledge that's directly from Allah, right? This is a concept of wahi. And we only believe prophets get wahi, meaning Quran, revelation, etc. But there's a concept of ilham, inspiration, in Islam, meaning anybody, you or I even, and when you attain a certain spiritual state, this only comes from lifetimes of striving and by the permission of Allah, not because of your own action. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can reveal something to you directly or inspire you right, to something directly. Now, it doesn't mean it's something that's applicable to everyone else. It's not something that gets codified into fiqh or Islamic law, etc., but it's something you can use for yourself. And so one of the things that and this is where I'm trying to get at, haqqul yaqeen means you get to a certain point where you're experiencing the reality. And this is ultimately what everyone's aspiration is. The purpose of our salah and our striving to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is so that it's not just so we witness these miracles, right? There are teachers saying that should not be an intention. But rather, if your state with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is so high, you get to a point where He will unveil certain things to you. This is what happened with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. When we think about Isra and Mi'raj, I'm trying to put things in place together because these things make so much more sense when you understand them the way they're meant to be understood. How many of you know what happened on Isra and Mi'raj? And when the Prophet ﷺ was taken, for example, to the other prophets and led them in prayer, I'll ask a question. Were those prophets alive? So then how did he pray or lead them in prayer? The question was, for things like, I'm giving Isra and Mi'raj as an example. And it's okay. If the Prophet ﷺ went and he saw the prophets and he was with them and he led them in prayer and they weren't alive, how did it happen? Does anybody know? Has anybody thought about that? These are things we should ask questions about because these are things that help us understand the reality of our deen. They're not stories, right? A lot of these things are mutawatir, meaning they've been transmitted from so many people that, and there's a unanimous consensus upon it, that there's no doubt that it happened. And in the same way, right? Same story. And so the way, right, and this is what we're talking about, haqqul yaqeen, that certain people get to certain stations. This is not just the Prophet ﷺ, we'll talk about this. That the unseen is unveiled to them. And there's a concept in Islam, right, the barzakh, which is when you're between the grave and the day of judgment. When you're buried, right, your soul is with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But there are certain people, for example, that their soul is allowed to roam. Right? And so you'll see, and we'll talk about this, gets very deep, we'll talk about it in a little bit, but basically there are certain even like prophets or certain like awliya of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who, even though they're passed away, people have witnessed them, and when we say witness, not in a physical sense, doing tawaf around the Kaaba. Right? So how do they do that if they're not alive? Right? It's not that they're alive in a secret sense, etc., but that their soul, right, is part of the unseen. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He allows that to be unveiled to anybody that He wishes. Right? And so when the Prophet ﷺ, he went to pray with the prophets, etc., it wasn't that he was leading them, at least to my knowledge, right, in a physical sense, because they passed away. They're in the graves. Right? And this is in the hadith that the Prophet ﷺ, when he went to see Musa alayhi salam, he saw him praying in his grave. Right? He saw him physically praying in his grave. It was his soul. Right? And so when he led them, it was that the unseen was unveiled to him, and that you can meet people as if, and this is not everyone, this is very special people, that you can meet people as if they're in front of you. And they can take almost like, so the best way to put it, right, is the Prophet ﷺ could have been there praying with the prophets, but some of his companions, or even, for example, some of the people who didn't believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could have been there and they wouldn't have seen it. So this is what's called kashf. It's what's called the unseen, like unveiling of the unseen. And this is a concept, right, in Islam that is unanimous because it has to be, because the Prophet ﷺ did it. But not only that, but and this only happens by the permission of Allah, but people today, and we've sat with people like this, right, and they won't tell you about it because it's an adab to not unveil certain things. But when you talk about haqqul yaqeen, people who have achieved such spiritual ranks, that there are people who are literally visited by the Prophet ﷺ today. And this again is a hadith, and these aren't like da'if hadith, these are strong hadith, that whoever sees me in a sleeping state will see me in a waking state. Now how can the Prophet ﷺ say that when he's alive? What does that even mean? Okay? It's because it's a concept, it's a reality. And so there's actually people, and some of the biggest muhaddithun, and sorry I'm going on a tangent, but this tends to be very interesting for people. Some of the biggest muhaddithun, how many of you have heard of people like Imam Suyuti or Imam Nawawi? They're some of the biggest, like these are people who memorized thousands of hadith, and are some of the greatest scholars in Islam. And so Imam Suyuti and some of the other muhaddithun would say, when I had doubt about a hadith, because keep in mind they didn't have like a full, not that this mattered because everything was so codified, even in their time, they had access to basically all of the knowledge of hadith from the Prophet ﷺ to that time because people preserved it so well. But basically it said if I had doubt about the authenticity of a hadith, I would ask the Prophet ﷺ myself. Right? SubhanAllah. Right? And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to, at least in our lifetime, even be visited by the Prophet ﷺ in a dream. Right? Imagine the state that you have to be in, right? And this is why you actually have certain things. I don't want to use this one. There are certain hadith that, from a dunyawi perspective, are classified as weak, as da'if. Now again, da'if doesn't mean fake. It means there's a chance that somebody in the chain is unknown or has other attributes to them, but there's a chance it's real. And it's very important because people are trying to mix that up now. They're saying there's weak hadith and fabricated hadith are the same. That's not true. Fabricated hadith are things that have no trace back to the Prophet ﷺ. Da'if hadith are hadith that have weak links. And so from a dunyawi perspective, you might not have all the books that can trace it back to the Prophet ﷺ. Those might have been lost, they might have been burned. Right? So there are certain scholars who said, okay, well, I don't have the proof that in the books that this is real. Right? So I went with the Prophet ﷺ and he validated it. Now what does that tell you? That the same hadith, and again, you can't, I just want to be very clear because this is sometimes misconstrued. That doesn't mean you can use it as a point of fiqh or a point of legality, right? Because there's no universal proof of that, but rather that was shown to you. So now you know that's true, you act upon it, right? That's up to you. And that goes to there are people who, there's people who have received hadith from the Prophet ﷺ that there's no record of. Now, again, does that mean that you tell other people? No. But what does that mean? That you can then use that, right? And you get rewarded for that. Right? Because anything in reality that the Prophet ﷺ tells you is a hadith. Right? He could tell you, like salam, it's not really something you act upon, but that's something he told you. Right? And so this is haqq al-yaqeen. And this is so important because we think about our religion in the context oftentimes about the Prophet ﷺ and the oldest of companions and the oldest, right, who are the most righteous and who set the pinnacle of what we aspire to, right? There's nothing that is more important than what they did. But there's also a very real reality in recognizing those people who experience those things are alive today. They're today. And my teacher is an example of this. And there's lots of others, not to promote any one person, there's lots of other examples. For anybody who is sincere with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and they spend their lifetime pursuing Him, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will reveal things, right? Inshallah, by His will, if it's something that He finds us to benefit from, He'll show certain things to them. And for me, and I'm just going to say this because I want to be very clear, right? Like I haven't experienced personally some of those things, but the ayat and the signs that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed in my personal life, right, not in terms of like inspiration or ilham, is like certain things. For example, you go through points in your life that you think something is good for you, and then you look back and you say, wow, I'm so glad that didn't happen, right? And then it happens again and again and again, and then you'll realize one thing is connected to the next thing which had to happen so the next thing could happen, right? And you'd be a fool to think that all of those things perfectly lined up in coincidence, right, to get to where you want it to be. And then it happens to each person, right? All of that is coincidence, right? Like, and these are our own personal signs. Right? These are our own personal signs, and I'll just share one more story because I like the storytelling aspect of it. Is how many of you know Imam Abu Hanifa? Right? Who is he?
Imams are the one of the four madhahib.
Yeah, right. And we talked about the madhahib last time. There are lots of other madhahib that existed, right? Hundreds, but they didn't stand the test of time, right? Their students either didn't codify it, it didn't carry on through time. And that's why there are four, because they were preserved through the centuries. So undoubtedly, like this is a way of thinking that is permissible to follow because of the level of scholarly depth that it goes into. Right? You're not just making up your own rulings. Imam Abu Hanifa, he was known to be one of the master theologians of his time. So much so, nobody wanted to debate with him because they knew it doesn't matter what you believed or what you knew, that if you came to Imam Abu Hanifa, he would prove why you were wrong. Right? If you held a belief outside truth, outside of haqq, then they would say, and these are in the descriptions in his books, that if he wanted to convince you that pillar in front of you is gold, he'd find a way to do it. Okay? Because he had proofs for everything. and he didn't act on anything except that there was a proof from the Quran and the Sunnah. And so that when people tell you, oh, you follow Imam Abu Hanifa, right? And not, no, all of these madhab come from the Prophet, come from an understanding of what the Prophet ﷺ did. Right? So anybody who tells you that, well, I follow the Prophet ﷺ, all of us follow the Prophet ﷺ, right? That's a silly argument. And so one of the stories that, again, is preserved about him is that it was, I'm just paraphrasing here, it was his, there was somebody who was known to be like a very, very big debater, right? And he would say, where's Imam Abu Hanifa? Like, I want to debate him. I'm going to prove him wrong. He's the one that everybody says I need to debate. I'm going to debate him. I'm going to beat him, right? And it got to a point where they agreed, let's find this time, let's debate, let's hear each other, and, let's see who's true, who has truth. And I want to preface this by saying there are very specific hadith that say that the angels stay away from people who engage in argumentation and stuff like that. But when we understand this in the context of scholarly debates, it's different, right? And because there's an adab. And when you lose that adab, and you see this unfortunately today, even amongst scholars, when you lose an adab, when you start criticizing people for certain things, stay away from those people, right? Be very careful, because it's an indication your knowledge hasn't benefited you. And there are very specific hadith that say a person who argues with people, that the angels stay away from them. Right? You want to be very careful of that. But it's permissible, right? Imam Shafi'i would engage in debate, all of these things. But basically he said, let me see what this person's going to say. I'll go, inshallah, I'll meet with him and we'll debate. And then the time came, the man is there, Imam Abu Hanifa is waiting. Imam Abu Hanifa is not there. And everyone is waiting. The whole city has gathered to listen to this debate, because they're like, this is going to be this is like the event of our year, right? Like the two biggest debaters are going to go head to head. It's like a intellectual UFC fight, right? And so they're waiting, and he doesn't show up, right? And then the man starts to say, this is your Imam, right? Abu Hanifa, he doesn't even show up on time, right? And he begins to criticize him, and it goes on, and then it gets to a point where people are about to leave, and then Imam Abu Hanifa comes, and they say, where were you all this time, right? And he says that, I was trying to get here on time, and I was waiting by the river, but the boat never came, right? So I missed it, and I was late. But then all of a sudden, the tree that I was standing by, it just fell into the water. And then all of a sudden, it started chopping itself up. And then all of a sudden, all the logs arranged themselves together. And then I got on it, and then all of a sudden, it took me here, right? And then the guy looks at him, and he's like, this is your Imam, right? Like, this is the person you call your the most knowledgeable person of your city. And he laughs at him. And what they were debating was the existence of Allah, right? The existence of God. So he's like, so you think that's crazy, but you don't think that everything in the entire world, from the stars to all of the planets, to the world, to all of the trees, to the water, to the life, you think all of that just happened on accident, right? And so they didn't even start the debate, but he won, right? And then everybody left. But this is, an example of how the people of Allah, they think. They don't need proof. You want proofs, right? There are certain, one, because of the time that we live in, but two, there are hadith about this, right? People of knowledge aren't the same as people without knowledge. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, وَلَا تَقْفُ مَا لَيْسَ لَكَ بِهِ. Like, do you just act without knowledge? And that's something that we ask ourselves. If we're praying, do we know why we're praying? Right? If we are fasting, do we know why we're fasting? Right? Both from a rational, like a dunyawi perspective, but also from the akhirah. And if we don't find a dunyawi benefit to it, that's okay. Right? But there is a logical reason Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives for most of his things. And if he doesn't, there's a clear indicator as to why he wants us to do it. Nothing just happens by chance. And so, just goes to show the importance, right, of knowledge. And that, again, also came primarily from all of this conversation we're having about the ayat of Allah, right, the proofs, the signs, and they're all around us. And like, to be a person of haqq al-yaqeen or even ilm al-yaqeen, you have to look for the proofs. Otherwise, you're going to look and see life pass you by and all of these things happen, and you don't even think once that, why did any of this happen to me? When everything happens for a reason, every single thing, and you have to find the silver lining or the reason. And sometimes that's not revealed to you, that's not made clear to you, even an entire lifetime. Right? There were some prophets, Zakaria alayhi salam, who waited 70, 80 years to have a kid. Whereas most of us, we'd say after you're, age 30 or 40, biologically it's not possible anymore, like yada, 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 and then you're like, there's no chance. But these are people of Allah that held hope in it, and they recognize if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted, He could make anything be, right? And so that, hopefully, we actually didn't get too much into the next chapter of the book, but how do we position ourselves to in our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and how do we ascend these different ranks, right? Because the more that you do it, the more that you are sincere in it, the more Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will unveil it right to you. And I can tell you with confidence in my own life, this is the only reason, it's not the only reason, but one of the biggest reasons I became so thirsty to go spend time with my teachers and learning knowledge, is that you recognize the more that you know, the more that you start to make sense of the world, and all of these questions that you had, and all of these things about the seen and the unseen, and all of these things are crystal clear. And the fact that we have a religion that tells us both about the things that we empirically and objectively know and the things that we empirically cannot measure is such a beautiful thing. And so it's funny when people come and say there's no empirical proof for this, because number one, there is, and number two, you're trying to empirically measure something that has no empirical measure. Does that make sense? I met with people who say, I believe in Islam, but I can't believe that Maryam alayhi salam gave birth without a man, right? Because God uses cause and effect to make things happen. But the reality is that, and he does, right? That's just a sunnah, right, of Allah. That's how you see it. But he can defy that. He can do whatever he wants, right? And the whole concept of a miracle is defying reason, defying normal things. So how are you going to say that I can't prove a miracle by science when miracle by definition is something that defies science? That logically doesn't make any sense, right? And so, inshallah, that is something that is food for thought that we keep in mind. Even make an intention right now that what is something that I'm going to do to witness a sign or an ayah of Allah. Even if it's as simple as looking at the full moon. I have a full moon calendar on my calendar, so anytime it's a full moon, and you can go outside and you can go see it. Right? Because they're beautiful things that remind you of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And inshallah, we'll end with that. I think we have 5 minutes for Maghrib. We can start, inshallah, with just any few questions, because what we'll try to do is after Maghrib, similarly, we'll just come down. I think there's food. There is food, and then salawat again for 10-15 minutes, just to get in a habit of it. But we'll try to just end within 15 minutes post-Maghrib so people don't have to stay too long. Does anybody have any questions or things that they're